Alright, welcome back to another segment of a Memory of Light read-through by me, Calculator Ferret. Alright, let's get right into it. Talmanes tugged on Selfire's reins, making the horse dance and shake his head. The roan seemed eager. Perhaps Selfire sensed his master's anxious mood. The night air was thick with smoke and screams. Talmanes marched the band alongside a road clogged with refugees smudged with soot. They moved like floats in a muddy river. The men of the band eyed the refugees with worry. "Steady!" Talmanes shouted to them. "We can't sprint all the way to Caemlyn. Steady!" He marched the men as quickly as he dared, nearly at a jog. Their armor clanked. Elaine had taken half the band with her to the field of Marilor, including Estienne and most of the cavalry. Perhaps she had anticipated needing to withdraw quickly. Well, Talmanes wouldn't have had much use for cavalry in the streets, which were no doubt as clogged as this roadway. Selfire snorted and shook his head. They were close now. The city walls just ahead, black in the night, held in an angry light. It was as if the city were a fire pit. By grace and banners fallen, Talmanes thought with a shiver. Enormous clouds of smoke billowed over the city. This was bad. Far worse than when the Aelid came for Carian. Talmanes finally gave Selfire his head. The roan galloped along the side of the road for a time, and Talmanes reluctantly forced his way across, ignoring pleas for help. Time he'd spent with Matt made him wish there was something more he could offer these people. It was downright strange, the effect Matcham Cthulhu had on a person. Talmanes looked at common folk in a very different light now. Perhaps it was because he still didn't rightly know whether to think of Matt as a lord or not. On the other side of the road, he surveyed the burning city, waiting for his men to catch up. He could have mounted all of them. Though they weren't trained cavalry, every man in the band had a horse for long-distance travel. Tonight he didn't dare. With Trollocs and Murdril lurking in the streets, Talmanes needed his men in immediate fighting shape. Crossbowmen marched with loaded weapons at the flanks of deep columns of pikemen. He could not leave his soldiers open to a Trolloc charge, no matter how urgent their mission. What if they lost those dragons? Light illumine us, Talmanes thought. The city seemed to be boiling with all that smoke churning above. Yet some parts of the inner city, rising high on the hill and visible over the walls, were not yet aflame. The palace wasn't on fire yet. Could the soldiers there be holding? No word had come from the queen, and from what Talmanes could see, no help had arrived from the city. The queen must still be unaware, and that was bad. Very, very bad. Ahead, Talmanes spotted Sandip with some of the band scouts. The slender man was trying to extricate himself from a group of refugees. "Please, good master," one young woman was crying. "My child, my daughter, in the heights of the northern march." "I must reach my shop," a stout man bellowed. "My glasswares." "My good people," Talmanes said, forcing his horse among them. "I should think that if you want us to help, you might wish to back away and allow us to reach the bloody city." The refugees regularly backed away, and Sandip nodded to Talmanes in thanks. Tan-skinned and dark-haired, Sandip was one of the band's commanders and an accomplished hedge doctor. The affable man wore a grim expression today, however. "Sandip," Talmanes said, pointing. "There." In the near distance, a large group of fighting men clustered, looking at the city. "Mercenaries," Sandip said with a grunt. "We passed several batches of them. Not a one seemed inclined to lift a finger." "We shall see about that," Talmanes said. People still flooded out through the city gates, coughing, clutching meager possessions, leading crying children. That flow would not soon slacken. Caemlyn was as full as that inn on market day that the ones lucky not to be escaping will only be a small fraction compared to those still inside. "Talmanes," Sandip said quietly, "that city's going to become a death trap soon. There aren't enough ways out. If we let the band become pinned inside—" "I know, but—" At the gates, a wave of feeling surged through the refugees. It was almost a physical thing, a shudder. The screams grew more intense. Talmanes spun. Hulking figures moved in the shadows inside of the gate. "Light!" Sandip said. "What is it?" "Trollocs," Talmanes said, turning Selfire. "Light! They're going to try to seize the gates and stop the refugees." There were 5 gates out of the city. If the Trollocs held all of them... This was already a slaughter. If the Trollocs could stop the frightened people from fleeing, it would grow far worse. "Hurry the ranks!" Talmanes yelled. "All men to the city gates!" He spurred Selfire into a gallop. The building would have been called an inn elsewhere. though Isam had never seen anyone inside except for the dull-eyed woman who tended the few drab rooms and prepared tasteless meals. Visits here were never for comfort. He sat in a hard stool at a pine table so worn of age it had likely grayed long before Isam's birth. He refrained from touching the surface overly much, lest he come away with more splinters than the ale had spears. Isam's dented tin cup was filled with dark liquid, though he wasn't drinking. He sat beside the wall, near enough to the inn's single window to watch the dirt street outside, dimly lit in the evening by a few rusty lanterns hung outside buildings. Isam took care not to let his profile show through the smeared glass. He never looked directly out. It was always best not to attract attention in the town. That was the only name the place had, if it could be said to have a name at all. The sprawling, ramshackle buildings had been put up and replaced countless times over 2,000 years. It actually resembled a good-sized town, if you squinted. Most of the buildings had been constructed by prisoners, often of little or no knowledge of the craft. They had been supervised by men equally ignorant. A fair number of the houses seemed held up by those to either side of them. Sweat dribbled down the side of Isam's face as he covertly watched the street. Which one would come for him? In the distance he could barely make out the profile of a mountain splitting the night sky. Metal rasped against metal somewhere out in the town like steel heartbeats. Figures moved on the streets. Men, heavily cloaked and hooded, with faces hidden up to the eyes behind blood-red veils. Isam was careful not to let his eyes linger on them. Thunder rumbled. The slopes of that mountain were filled with odd lightning bolts that struck upwards through the ever-present grey clouds. Few humans knew of this town not so far from the valley of Thakandar, with Shale Gull itself looming above. Few knew rumors of its existence. Isam would not have minded being among the ignorant. Another of the men passed. Red veils. They kept them up always. Well, almost always. If you saw one lower his veil, it was time to kill him. Because if you didn't, he'd kill you. Most of the red-veiled men seemed to have no reason to be out, beyond scowling at each other and perhaps kicking at the numerous stray dogs, slack-ribbed and feral, whenever one crossed their path. The few women who had left shelter scuttled along the edges of the street, eyes lowered. There were no children to be seen, and likely few to be found. The town was no place for children. Isam knew. He had grown from infancy here. One of the men passing on the street looked up at Isam's window and stopped. Isam went very still. The Samanasi, the Islanders, had always been touchy and full of pride. No, touchy was too mild a term. They required no more than whim to take a knife to one of the talentless. Usually it was one of the servants who paid. Usually. The red-veiled man continued to regard him. Isam stilled his nerves and did not make a show of staring back. His summons here had been urgent, and one did not ignore such things if one wished to live. But still, if the man took one step towards the building, Isam would slip into Tellarandra-hood, secure in the knowledge that not even one of the Choosen could follow him from here. Abruptly, the Samanase turned from the window. In a flash he was moving away from the building, striding quickly. Isam felt some of his tension melt away, though it would never truly leave him. Not in this place. This place was not home, despite his childhood here. This place was death. Motion. Isam glanced through the end of the street. Another tall man, in a black coat and cloak, was walking towards him, his face exposed. Incredibly, the street was empty as Samanasi darted off down other streets and alleys. So it was Moradin. Isam had not been there to witness the Choosen's first visit to the town, but he had heard. The Samanasi had thought Moradin one of the talentless until he demonstrated differently. The constraints that held them did not hold him. The numbers of dead in Samanasi varied of the telling, but the claim never dipped below a dozen. By the evidence of his eyes, Isam could believe it. When Moradin reached the end, the street was empty save for the dogs, and Moradin walked right on past. Isam watched as closely as he dared. Moradin seemed uninterested in him or the inn, which is where Isam had been instructed to wait. Perhaps the Choosen had other business, and Isam would be an afterthought. After Moradin passed, Isam finally took a sip of his dark drink. The locals just called it fire. It lived up to its name. It was supposedly related to some drink from the waste. Like everything else in the town, it was a corrupt version of the original. After Moradin passed, Isam... Oops, my bad. How long was Moradin going to make him wait? Isam didn't like being here. It reminded him too much of his childhood. A servant passed, a woman of a dress so flayed that it was practically rags, and dropped a plate into the table. The two didn't exchange a word. Isam looked at his meal. Vegetables, peppers and onions mostly, sliced thin and boiled. He picked at one and took a taste, then sighed and pushed the meal aside. The vegetables were as bland as unseasoned millet porridge. There wasn't any meat. That was actually good. He didn't like to eat meat unless he'd seen it killed and slaughtered himself. That was a remnant of his childhood. If you hadn't seen it slaughtered yourself, you couldn't know. Not for certain. Up here, if you found meat, it could have been something that they'd been caught in the south, or maybe an animal then raised up here, a cow or a goat. Or it could be something else. People lost games up here and couldn't pay, then disappeared. And Alpha, the salmon of the sea who didn't breed true, washed out of their training. Bodies vanished. Corpses rarely lasted long enough for burial. Burn this place, Isam thought, stomach unsettled. Burn it with... Someone entered the inn. He couldn't watch both approaches to the door from this direction, unfortunately. She was a pretty woman, dressed in black, trimmed with red. Isam didn't recognize her slim feature and delicate face. He was increasingly certain he could recognize all the Choosen. He'd seen them often in the dream. They didn't know that, of course. They thought themselves masters of the place, and some of them were very skilled. He was equally skilled, and also exceptionally good at not being seen. Whoever this was, she was in disguise then. Why bother hiding yourself here? Either way, she had to be the one who had summoned him. No woman walked the town with such an imperious expression, such self-assurance, as if she expected the rocks themselves to obey if told to jump. Isam went quickly down on one knee. That motion woke the ache inside his stomach from where he'd been wounded. He still hadn't recovered from the fight with the wolf. He felt a stirring inside of him. Luke hated Ayabara. Unusual. Luke tended to be the more accommodating one, Isam the hard one. Well, that was how he saw himself. Either way, on this particular wolf, they agreed. On one hand, Isam was thrilled. As a hunter, he'd rarely been presented with such a challenge as Ayabara. However, his hatred is deeper. He would kill Ayabara. Isam covered a grievance at the pain and bowed his head. The woman left him kneeling and took a seat at his table. She tapped a finger on the side of the tin cup for a few moments, staring at its contents, and did not speak. Isam remained still. Many of these fools who named themselves dark friends would squirm and writhe when another asserted power over them. Instead, he admitted with reluctance, Luke would probably squirm just as much. Isam was a hunter. That was all he cared to be. When you were secure of what you were, there was no cause to resent being shown your place. Burn it, but the sight of his belly did ache. I want him dead, the woman said. Her voice was soft, yet intense. Isam said nothing. I want him gutted like an animal, his bowels spilled into the ground, his blood a milk pan for ravens, his bones left to bleach, then gray, then crack in the heat of the sun. I want him dead, Hunter. Althor. Yes, you have failed in the past. Her voice was ice. He felt a chill. This one was hard. Hard as Moradine. In his years of service, he had learned contempt for most of the Chosen. They bickered like children for all their power and supposed wisdom. This woman made him pause, and he wondered if he actually had spied on all of them. She seemed different. Well, she asked, do you speak for your failures? Each time one of the others has tasked me with this hunt, he said, another has come to pull me away and set me in some other task. In truth, he'd rather have continued the hunt for the wolf. He would not disobey orders, at least not direct ones from the Chosen. Other than Ayabara, one hunt was much the same to him as another. He would kill this dragon, if he had to. Such won't happen this time, the Chosen said, still staring at his cup. She hadn't looked at him, and she did not give him leave to stand, so he remained kneeling. All others have a renounced claim on you. Unless the great lord tells you otherwise, unless he summoned you himself, you are to keep to this task. Kill Althor. Motion outside the window caused Isam to glance to the side. The Chosen didn't look as a group of black hooded figures passed. The winds didn't cause the cloaks of these figures to stir. They were accompanied by carriages, an unusual sight in the town. The carriages moved slowly, but still rocked and thumped in the uneven street. Isam didn't need to see into the carriage's curtained windows to know that 13 women rode inside, matching the number of Myrgil. None of the salmon in the sea returned to the street. They tended to avoid processions like this. For obvious reasons, they had strong feelings about such things. The carriages passed. So, another had been caught. Isam would have assumed that the practice had ended once the taint was cleansed. Before he turned back to look at the floor, he caught sight of something most incongruous. A small, dirty face watching from the shadow of an alleyway across the street. Wide eyes, but a furtive posture. Morden's passing, and the coming of the 13, had driven the salmon to sea off the street. Where they were not, the urchins would go in some safety. Maybe. Isam wanted to scream at the child to go, tell to run, to risk crossing the Bright. To die in the stomach of a worm was better than to live in this town, and to suffer what it did to you. Go! Flee! Die! The moment passed quickly, the urchin retreating to the shadows. Isam could remember being that child. He learned so many things then. How to find food that you could mostly trust, and wouldn't vomit back up once you found out what was in it. How to fight with knives, how to avoid being seen or noticed. And how to kill a man, of course. Everyone who survived long enough in the town learned that particular lesson. The Choosen was still looking at his cup. It was her reflection she was looking at, Isam noticed. What did she see there? I will need help, Isam finally said. The Dragon Reborn has guards, and he is rarely in the dream. Help has been arranged, she said softly, but you are to find him, Hunter. None of this playing as you did before, or trying to draw him to you. Lews Therin will sense such a trap. Besides, he will not deviate from his cause now. Time is short. She spoke of the disastrous operation in the Two Rivers. Luke had been in charge there. What knew Isam of real towns, real people? Almost, he felt a longing for those things, though he suspected that was really Luke's emotion. Isam was just a hunter. People held little interest for him beyond the best places for an arrow to reach so as to hit the heart. That Two Rivers operation, though, it stank like a carcass left to rot. He still didn't know. Had the point really been to lure Althor, or had it been to keep Isam away from important events? He knew his abilities had fascinated the Choosen. He could do something that they could not. Oh, they could imitate the way he stepped into the dream, but they needed channeling, gateways, time. He was tired of being a pawn in their games. Just let him hunt. Stop changing the prey of each passing week. One did not say such things to the Choosen. He kept his objections to himself. Shadows darkened the doorway to the inn, and the serving woman disappeared into the back. That left the door completely empty. It left a place completely empty, save for Isam and the Choosen. You may stand, she said. Isam did, hastily, as two men stepped into the room, tall, muscular, and red-veiled. They wore brown clothing like ale, but didn't carry spears or bows. These creatures killed with weapons far deadlier. Though he kept his face impassive, Isam felt a surge of emotion. A childhood of pain, hunger, and death. A lifetime avoiding the gaze of men like these. He fought hard to keep himself from trembling as they strode to the table, moving at the grace of natural predators. The men dropped their veils and bared their teeth. Burn me. Their teeth were filed. These had been turned. You could see in their eyes that weren't quite right, weren't quite human. Isam nearly fled right then, stepping into the dream. He couldn't kill both these men. He'd have been reduced to ash before he managed to take down even one of them. He'd seen Sanderson kill. They often did, just to explore new ways of using their powers. They didn't attack. Did they know this woman was chosen? Why then, lower their veils? Sanderson never lowered their veils except to kill, and only for the kill they were most eagerly anticipating. They will accompany you, the Choosen said. You shall have a handful of the talentless as well to help deal with Althor's guards. She turned to him, and for the first time she met his eyes. She seemed revolted, as if she was disgusted to need his aid. They will accompany you, she said. Not, they will serve you. Bloody son of a dog. This is going to be a hateful job.